Well, it's good to be with you this morning. As summer comes to an end, this is going to be the first summer, probably in about a decade, that our family has not had a summer road trip. Over the last few years, have had a trip to Colorado, to and from Colorado, or to and from Texas, or anywhere in between that we've often had as part of our summer plans. And so we've gotten kind of used to road trips, and we kind of like them in a way. I have not lived in the Midwest for long, but I felt very much at home as I learned that a lot of you share my feelings about this. Why would you fly someplace when it's just a quick 14-hour drive away, right? And so along the road trip, I've learned to appreciate audiobooks and podcasts. And then there's something that we have all played together called the license plate game. Does anybody play this on your road trips, or have you played this? I'm sure a lot of you have. Well, for at least the first 30 minutes of every trip, everybody's engaged. And after that, it's just me listing off states while everybody else has headphones in, and I'm just talking to myself. But it keeps me going, so I can't complain. Well, we usually have a way of keeping track of which states we hit on or what we haven't seen. And there tend to be a few states that are always at the bottom of that list. You can probably guess some of them: Alaska, Hawaii. There was a time in Denver, Colorado, that we were driving on the main highway through there, and we saw a Hawaii license plate in the wild for the first time. And we had our windows down. We were cheering and roaring as we passed this guy. And I don't know what he thought we were doing, but we were so pumped that it was Hawaii. Maybe people do that to him every day. Maybe not. We'll see. Well, anyway, one of those license plates that we often have a hard time finding in the Midwest or Western U.S. is the state of New Hampshire. Do I have any Granite Staters in attendance? None at 9 a.m. Okay. Well, we have a picture of the New Hampshire state license plate. Maybe some of you have seen this on the roads or are familiar with it. The first thing that stands out is the state motto that's above the license plate number: live free or die. Now, that's a pretty stark thing. There's a whole history to that. We could go down that rabbit trail, but we're not. When my wife and I was in grad school in the Boston area. We lived north of the city of Boston, and the states over in the East Coast are pretty compact. So we actually lived within about 30 minutes from the state of New Hampshire. And one of the things that we learned from our friends who live there is that this state motto, live free or die, is so deeply ingrained in the state of New Hampshire and their identity that they are the only state in the country that still does not require seatbelts for adults. They do not want the government telling you whether you have to wear it or not. Now, interestingly, a lot of them still choose to wear it, but they just don't want the government telling them what they have to do. Now, I'm sure we might have differing views in this room about what and how the government should regulate our freedoms. And guess what? We're free to have those differing opinions, right? But we all have to acknowledge that there are times where our rights, our freedoms, well, they come in conflict with other people's rights and freedoms and how we can live together in a good way in society. We have to decide, how are we going to navigate the different rights that we want to have, the different freedoms that we want to have. Well, some of you may have remembered maybe some of our history or government or philosophy people. Maybe in college you read a work by a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. Anybody have to do that? You don't raise your hand. You're probably not going to want people to know that. But he was a French philosopher and politician who came to America in the 1830s, and he was trying to figure out what is behind this American experiment. What is really going on at a ground level in this democracy? And he wrote this. He said that I feel like is very true as much today as ever. Nothing is more wonderful than the art of being free, but nothing is harder to learn how to use than freedom. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a nation, a state, a city, or you're talking about your family, you're talking about your workplace, you're talking about your church community, you're talking just about the people that you live and work around each and every day. We're all trying to work out, how do we use our freedom well? Well, this morning we're coming to the end of the first half, or first part, I should say, of our sermon series in the book of 1 Corinthians. And this is the theme that Paul is going to be picking up. So we're going to come back to 1 Corinthians. For those of you who want to catch the other half in October, we'll come back to it and finish out the book. But today, we're kind of hitting the end of a section in chapter 9, and maybe a little bit before that, a little bit after that too. Can't be defined too much there. But we're going to be looking at this idea of how Paul describes Christian freedom and how he describes it in a way that's really different than I think we're often accustomed to thinking about it. Instead of live free or die, Paul says it's more like live free by dying. Paul says and lives out amongst the Corinthians that we are most free when we're constrained, when we're driven, not by our rights, but by our loves. And that Paul's words for the Corinthians back then and for us today is that we need to learn to live a cross-shaped freedom. So the past few weeks, we've been looking at a few maybe hot topics, I guess you could say. And so I actually just want to pick up a thread that is at the kind of right here in the middle of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 6 all the way to 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says something that he repeats himself. And the reason he repeats himself is that this was a dominant idea in Corinth. And I think you might hear a little bit of it in our world today. Paul says in chapter 6, before addressing the topic of sex, he says, you Corinthians, you say, I have the right to do anything. And then Paul replies to that, well, but not everything is beneficial. And then he goes on in chapter 10, he's talking about this idea or this issue of eating food sacrificed to idols, which you may not think is relevant to your life yet, but hopefully you'll see ways that it applies by the end of today. But Paul says to them about this issue, he says, you say, Corinthians, I have the right to do anything. And Paul says, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is constructive or builds up. If the city of Corinth had license plates, maybe on their chariots or something like that, the motto on those license plates probably would have been pretty similar to New Hampshire. It would have been like live free or die, something like that. And this mindset had taken root in the church and in the whole culture. So a couple weeks ago, we had Petey and Emily preach on the topic of sex. And at the root of how they viewed that in Corinth was, I have the right to do anything. And when it applied to their bedrooms, it meant that they were taking the good gift of sex and using it in ways that were destructive to themselves and to their communities. And then last week, we heard our guest preacher, Andy, share about this idea of food sacrificed to idols. And what they were doing with that is they were saying, I have the right to do anything. And as they applied it to their dining rooms, as they applied it to how they ate meals with other people in the community, it meant that meals had become more of a time of division and argument than it was a place of fellowship and coming together. The Corinthians insisted on their right to do anything. And Paul, kind of underneath all this in this book, is saying, how's that working out for you? How's that working out for you right now? I'll give you a hint. When Paul wrote letters to churches, it usually wasn't because things were going so well. And so he wrote 2 to Corinth. As Paul says in response to this Corinthian motto, you have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. Not everything is constructive or builds up. Well, maybe you hear a little bit of the echoes of Corinth and that I have the right to do anything, and how the world today talks about freedom. So like Corinth, our culture celebrates freedom. And we talk about freedom being the right to pursue a life with no constraints. I don't want anybody else telling me how to live. That our culture celebrates the strong, those who are self-made and take things, by their bootstraps. I don't even know anybody with boots that have straps. But we care about being strong and doing things on our own. Well, like Corinth, we seem to live in a world that's about me and mine mostly or all the time. And we're told this false story of freedom that says you need to hold tightly to whatever you think you deserve. And we need to avoid anything that might add an encumbrance, that might add an inconvenience, that might require commitment on your part. Well, the definition of freedom that Paul is going to describing for us in this section is not the absence of any constraints. Paul's going to say it's actually about putting the right constraints around your life and in your life to help create a good and flourishing life. So let me give you an example of this. When my kids have gotten a little bit older now, but when they were little, in the toddler to like young kid stage, we spent a lot of time on playgrounds. In fact, I think I probably spent an hour every day and maybe several hours a day on playgrounds. Maybe some of you are experiencing that right now. You have a lot of time to think when you're on the playground sometimes. And so I actually, in the process, came across some research that was done about whether playgrounds should be fenced in or not. Maybe you've never spent a moment thinking about this. That's okay. In this study, basically, a lot of times they thought, oh, if we don't put a fence around the playground, kids will be more free. They can be themselves. And so what they found is actually when you don't fence in a playground, kids actually stay closer to their teacher, they stay closer to their parent, they stay closer to their caregiver, and they don't explore the whole playground. And in fact, they're less willing to be independent. When you put a fence on the playground, kids are a little bit more willing to go to the very edge. They're going to play on the equipment that's farther away. They're going to go explore a little bit more because they feel the safety of those boundaries. Now, maybe some of you have kids that are like, my kids climbed the fence and they're in the street at that point. But they're the exception that proves the rule. Removing the fences of playgrounds actually can give kids less freedom, not more. It's the right constraints. The right constraints don't inhibit our freedom. They create the conditions for it to be used properly. Okay, so it's this idea that Paul wants us to understand in chapter 9. So if you have a Bible, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 to 27. It's on page 1632 in your Pew Bible, or you could flip there in your Bible app. And we're going to read this section together. Because it's not just through his words, but even through his actions that Paul wants us to understand this cross-shaped freedom. He says in verse 19, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body, and I make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Okay, so what is Paul saying about how he's chosen to live? I realize it's a little complicated and technical, and I've been reading it for the past few weeks, and you're probably going, whoa, what's going on in that little section? Well, Paul is trying to say that he chose to constrain his freedom, not by his rights, what he felt entitled to or could have said is his own, but he's being constrained instead by his love for God and his love for other people. So the Corinthians had been having this dispute about whether they had the right to eat food or whether it was good for them to eat food that was sacrificed to idols. So you got to know a couple things about this without getting into all the nitty-gritty, I guess. In the midst of this, they had noticed that Paul's actions actually were different depending on who he was eating at. And they were bringing up to him that they felt like there was something wrong in what he was doing as a result. So with those who followed Jewish dietary laws, Paul also chose to follow those dietary laws. With Gentile Christians, aka those who are not Jewish, Paul did not expect them to keep dietary laws that had never applied to them. And so he followed their preferences in how he ate. And they said, that's inconsistent. What's going on here? You're not following the law as we would expect. You're not using your freedom as you can. And what Paul wants them to see is Paul's freedom is being governed not by these kind of laws, but by the law of love, the law of how can he love God first and his neighbor second in all things. And so his menu is dictated by his venue and his dining guest more than by his own preferences. If Paul were to approach the subject of which food can he eat food sacrificed to idols like the Corinthians, if he had followed their motto of I can do whatever I want, he would have been having bacon-wrapped shrimp with a side of lobster when he ate with the Jewish community. And he would have said, well, hey, it's my right. I can do whatever I want. I don't care that you don't think that I should be doing this. And with the Gentile Christians who maybe had previously been part of maybe pagan ceremonies and pagan rituals, he might have said, well, hey, I know you might be offended or might be confused why I'm eating this meat that was originally sacrificed to a pagan god, but it was half off and you can't pass up a good deal. So that's the steak that we're going to have tonight. But that's not what Paul does. Instead, Paul is using his freedom to love others in ways that are specific to them. As he says in verse 22, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. Even as it cost him personally, he was willing to do that in order that the gospel might spread. Okay, so let's bring this into focus for our own lives a little bit more. What is Paul trying to live out? What is he wanting us and the Corinthians to understand? I think at the heart of it, he's saying how we live amongst other people, how we use our freedom should be governed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says in verse 23, I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Well, the message of the cross that he's been talking about throughout 1 Corinthians, he tells us the world is going to say this is foolish. And if we're honest, there's a lot of times it feels kind of foolish to us, like, oh, I can't do that. I can't die to myself in that way. But what Paul is wanting us to understand is that as we do that, as we run, not to get the short-term prize of our own comfort, but as we run the race to get what is imperishable, as we head in that direction, we're going to experience the abundant and good life that only can come as we embrace this cross-shaped life. So just as Jesus came in weakness instead of strength, our lives should not be about becoming strong, but serving others as we've been served by Jesus. That just as Jesus didn't die for just the deserving ones, we who have received his grace, we don't just love those who we feel like are deserving of our love. We love everyone, whether they've earned it or not. And this is something that I came across this week that really struck me. That the Christian life is really full of many small deaths to self. And at the heart, this is kind of what cross-shaped freedom is all about. That it's not just one big moment, one time when you were a kid, or one big great message or song on a Sunday. It's the 100 tiny things that are going to happen to you this week that maybe won't be noticed by anybody besides you, or maybe just a couple people who are close enough in your life to see them. So let me give you a couple examples. So as I'm editing this and thinking through my message last night, I hear from our living room my kids arguing about something. And so I emerge out, and they're arguing about a very normal thing in our house, maybe not in your house. And but they're arguing about who gets to sit where on the couch. And I called seat check, and you took my seat, and I want to watch this. And I said, guys, don't you understand? I'm like literally working on a sermon about this in the other room. I said, do you want to hear that sermon right now? They're like, no. I'm like, don't you understand? I said, what? They're like, well, if you snooze, you lose. And I said, do you want to be a you snooze, you lose family? And they said, that's what we are. And I said, oh, no. And my wife is going, just dial it back. Don't give them the sermon. And I had this moment of going, yep, we have modeled that in ways, and we are all naturally prone to being like, well, if I don't take it, I'm not going to get it. And I said, how's that working out for us? It's not, is it? Nobody's in the place they want. If somebody's toes are on me in this seat on the couch, or I don't get this or that. And instead of fighting about that, what if we looked at where can I sit so that somebody else might be more comfortable? Maybe is it my turn to give up my spot? And I'll tell you, the results weren't great last night. I'm going to say, just be real with you. We're not there yet. But I think it's those small, tiny deaths of self. There might be one victory and a couple setbacks, one victory, a couple setbacks. But as I think about it, that's what Jesus is calling us to. That's what the gospel of Jesus points us to. So I thought about it's going to mean some inconvenience in my life when I do those small deaths of self each day. It's going to require some risk on my part. It's going to require some giving up of things that I don't want to really give up. It's going to require depending on Jesus in ways that I'm not always used to depending on Jesus, even as a pastor, and of trusting that his way is better than mine. As I thought about a couple of particular areas for my life that these small deaths need to take place, I wanted to share a couple with you, and maybe you'll have others that you think about as well. And I guess I got one little caveat here is the small deaths to self and loving others doesn't mean that we're putting ourselves in situations where we have, where others can pose physical or emotional harm to us. I think that's an important little caveat to make there. But as I thought about how I approach conflict that I might have at work or with family or with friends, I thought the false story of freedom that our culture tells us, it says that, well, if I'm in conflict or if I'm in disagreement, I have a right to stew over it. I have a right to vent to my friends about how right I am. I have a right to wait for them to realize the error of their ways and come to me begging to make things right. And sometimes I might be more in the right. But the gospel of Jesus says that there is freedom in being reconciled. And it's worth the pain of being the first one to take the step to admit where I'm wrong and to make things right. Am I willing to put others before myself when I have conflict or hurt others with my words? I thought about my time, that the false story of freedom says that my time is scarce, that I find myself, I'm going to put up barriers to anything or anyone that might require an investment of my time. Oh, that feels like it's going to be a lot. I don't want to coach that sports team. But the gospel of Jesus says, yes, my time is precious. So how will I redeem it to love God and to love people? Am I willing to make a sacrifice of my time for the sake of others? As I thought about comfort, I thought, so much of my life is driven by what will bring me comfort. And I'm really opposed, maybe you are too, to anything that feels uncomfortable. Well, the false story of freedom says I should choose my comfort over anyone else's. And yet I think the gospel of Jesus says that we're meant to experience the comfort of God as we put the needs of others before our own. Am I willing to let go of my preferences for the sake of those around me? Friends, these small deaths of self, the little tiny moments, are what will help us experience the freedom of the gospel that we're really meant to have. So would you pray with me? Jesus, help us to remember that you offer us a path to true freedom, that you have brought us into a better story than what we hear in the world around us, that we can make the small deaths to self because you died for us once and for all to give us a new story, a new identity. Would you help us to see and desire the freedom that comes through loving you and loving others? May we not hold tightly to our rights, but would we lay them down to love others? We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.